Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're not just reading a book. We are essentially trying to decode a blueprint.
A blueprint for what, exactly?
It's a blueprint for how a prison is built, but not a prison with steel bars or concrete walls. This one is built with ideas, with habits, and with everything we just assumed to be true.
And this deep dive is tackling a question that I think, well, it nags at anyone who's really paying attention to the machinery of the modern world. The central inquiry is this: how is power actually maintained? Because if you look at history, or even just look out the window, ruling systems, doesn't matter if they're democracies or dictatorships, they rarely survive on brute force alone.
Right. That is the fundamental paradox of power, isn't it? If a government has to put a tank on every street corner or a soldier in every single classroom to keep people in line,
It's not working.
that government is actually incredibly weak. It's brittle. It's creating friction with every single interaction. The sources we're analyzing today argue that true, lasting power relies on something much more sophisticated.
Something quieter.
Much quieter. It relies on convincing people to consent to their own governance.
Which is a terrifying premise when you really stop and think about
That
it.
is.
It implies that the most effective cage is the one you don't even realize you're in.
Yeah.
So how do ruling systems get inside our heads to the point where a specific way of life, a specific hierarchy, just feels normal?
Natural.
Natural, like it's the only option there is.
And that is the mechanism we're talking about today. It's called cultural hegemony. It's the theory that institutions and norms and culture itself are what sustain power structures. It's not just the police or the military.
And this matters now more than ever. We live in these societies that, rely so heavily on cultural normalization. We aren't being whipped into submission.
No, not usually.
We're being educated and entertained and informed into it.
Exactly. So just a quick ground rule before we really open the files here.
Okay.
We are analyzing the structural dynamics we find in the text. This is not a biography of the author, and it is strictly not a partisan political endorsement of any kind.
Right. We're trying to understand the engine, not who's driving the car.
We just want to see how the machine works, as described in the source material. That's it.
And the source material is, well, it's massive. We're looking at the Prison Notebooks, volumes 1 through 3, by Antonio Gramsci.
And when we say notebooks, we should probably clarify what we're actually looking at.
Yeah, this isn't some polished manuscript sent to a publisher with a nice cover letter.
No, and that context is absolutely vital. Antonio Gramsci wasn't writing this from a cozy university office with a view of the quad. He was a prisoner.
A political prisoner.
A political prisoner. He was a founding member of the Communist Party of Italy, and he was incarcerated under the Italian fascist regime, Mussolini's regime, in the 1920s and 30s.
Talk about a crisis in perception. I mean, he's watching his entire country fall into a dictatorship, and he's locked in a cell. The prosecutor at his trial famously said, "We must stop this brain from working for 20 years.
But the brain didn't stop. He turned that cell into an intellectual workshop.
Yeah.
The sources described the actual physical notebooks. They were just ordinary school exercise books.
The kind a kid would use for homework.
Exactly, the kind you'd use for math or spelling practice. And they are not polished. They're a series of, fragmented notes, translations, little jottings.
The source even mentions you can actually see the prison seal, the warden's signature on the pages.
Yeah.
And that just drives home the incredible constraint he was under. He wasn't just writing for us, he was writing to keep his own sanity.
And to bypass the censors, this constraint actually shaped the very terminology of the writing itself. He had to write für ewig,
Which is German for
eternity, or for disinterested study. He couldn't write a political manifesto that would have been confiscated immediately. He had to pretend he was just doing historical analysis to get it past the guards.
So you won't find him writing Marxism or Lenin explicitly.
No, he uses code words. The philosophy of praxis instead of Marxism. Illich for Lenin.
It's like he had to invent a whole new language just to think clearly while he was being watched.
He did. But because of that, the text is completely nonlinear. It's a labyrinth. You'll find a note on Dante's Inferno sitting right next to a critique of some random serial novel, which is next to a translation of German grammar.
Which means it requires synthesis.
A lot of it. A note on 19th century Italian history might contain the key to his entire theory of the state. Our mission in this deep dive is to stitch these fragments together. Gramsci was building a philology, a study of language and history of power, but he never got to finish the book.
So we have to reconstruct the system he was building from the pieces he left behind.
That's the plan.
So let's get to it. The central thesis. What was the core argument buried in all these school notebooks?
The core argument is that ruling power is only truly robust when it achieves hegemony. Now, we hear that word a lot, but Gramsci defines it very, very specifically.
Okay.
Hegemony isn't just domination. It isn't just winning a fight. It's the shaping of common sense, of morality, of customs, so that a specific way of life seems
The only way.
natural and inevitable. It's when the ruling class doesn't just rule, it leads. It leads because the population has internalized the ruler's values as their own.
Okay, I want to unpack this distinction you're making between ruling and leading, because I think we often assume the state is just the government, the laws, the police, the taxes.
Right, the stuff you see.
But Gramsci draws this fascinating distinction here about what the state actually is.
He does. He basically breaks the state down into a formula, he says. State equals political society plus civil society.
Okay, political society sounds like the government part we're used to.
It is. Political society is the apparatus of coercion. It's the police, the army, the courts, the prisons.
The hard power.
The hard power. The night watchman, or the gendarme, as he calls it. It's the part of the state that forces you to comply when you break the rules. If you steal a loaf of bread, political society arrests you. If you riot, political society sends in the tear gas.
But his whole argument is that you can't run a stable society just on that.
Yeah.
If you're arresting everyone all the time, your system is failing.
Exactly. Coercion is expensive and it breeds resistance. That's where civil society comes in. And this is the crucial part. Gramsci defines civil society as the so-called private organisms.
Like what?
Schools, churches, the media, journalism, families, trade unions, even literary clubs. All the things we think of as separate from the government. This is where hegemony happens.
So the school teacher, the journalist, maybe even the priest, they are, in a structural sense, part of the state's machinery. That seems really counterintuitive.
It does, because in a liberal democracy, we're taught to view them as separate. But Gramsci argues that structurally, they function as the hegemonic apparatus. They're the transmission belts of ideology.
The software.
The software, yes. A stable state creates hegemony protected by the armor of coercion. If the hegemony works, you don't need the police very often. The school teaches you to be a good citizen and respect property.
The media tells you what's normal and what's radical.
The church gives you moral instruction that just so happens to align with the social order.
So domination isn't just holding a weapon. It's educating the population to agree with your worldview.
Yes.
It's making the handcuffs feel comfortable in a way, or maybe making us feel like the handcuffs are just jewelry we chose to wear.
Or making them feel invisible. That's the real key. If the education system works the way it's supposed to, you don't feel coerced. You just feel like you're acting according to common sense.
You pay your taxes, you go to work, you respect the hierarchy.
Not because a soldier is pointing a gun at you, but because that's just what people do. It's just normal.
This leads us directly to the people who do that work, the architects of this consent. And Gramsci has a very specific and honestly a pretty challenging view on intellectuals.
This is one of his most misunderstood concepts for sure. When I say the word intellectual today, what pops into your head?
Probably a guy in a tweed jacket with elbow patches smoking a pipe in a library.
Okay.
Or maybe a tech visionary giving a TED Talk. Someone who is distinct from the regular workers, someone who deals in big ideas.
Right. And Gramsci completely rejects that distinction. He rejects the whole idea of the independent thinker floating in an ivory tower. He says that while everyone thinks everyone uses their brain, everyone possesses an intellect, not everyone functions as an intellectual in society.
So it's a job title.
It's about their function. For Gramsci, intellectuals are the officers of the ruling class. They are the organizers.
The organizers of society. So this isn't about how smart you are or how many books you've read. It's about your job description in the machine.
Exactly. And he distinguishes between two types. First, you have the traditional intellectuals.
Okay, who are they?
These are the clergy, the philosophers, the men of letters, the professors. They tend to view themselves as separate from history, standing above the fray, as keepers of some eternal truth. They think they're autonomous.
The classic ivory tower types. They think they're just pursuing truth with a capital T.
Right. But Gramsci argues they're actually tied to previous historical systems, usually the aristocracy or the church. In a way, they're fossils of a previous hegemony. But then you have the really critical category, the organic intellectuals.
Can you give me a concrete example of an organic intellectual? Because that term sounds a bit agricultural.
Think about the Industrial Revolution. When the capitalist class rose to power, they didn't just need money and factories. They needed to organize the whole of society around industry.
They needed a new kind of person.
A new kind of society. So they created the industrial technician. They needed economists to justify the free market and create trade policy. They needed judges to create contract law that favored business. They needed managers to organize the labor force.
So an economist working for a bank or a middle manager at a logistics company. In this framework, they're organic intellectuals.
Yes, they are organic to the economic base. They aren't just doing math or scheduling shipments. They are actively maintaining the system of capitalism. They mediate between the ruling class and the masses.
They translate the interests of the elite
Into the cultural values of everyone else. They manufacture the consent that the ruling class needs to lead.
This really changes how you look at expertise. It suggests it's not neutral. It always has a function. The lawyer isn't just practicing law, they're upholding the specific legal structure that maintains the current power dynamic.
Nothing in the prison notebooks is neutral. Everything has a function within the system of power. And this brings us to Gramsci's most famous metaphor, which explains why revolutions happen in some places but not others.
The war of maneuver versus the war of position.
Exactly. I love this analogy.
It's military strategy applied to sociology.
And it's crucial for understanding the modern world. A war of maneuver is a quick frontal attack.
Like a blitzkrieg.
Kind of. Think of the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Russian state under the Tsar was rigid, but it was also brittle. The Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, they seized control of the central apparatus, and the old order just collapsed almost overnight. It was a kinetic, rapid takeover.
But Gramsci says that strategy, which worked in Russia, fails in the West. Why is that?
Because in advanced Western societies, civil society acts as a complex system of earthworks and trenches.
The trenches. He's writing this right after World War I. So that imagery must have been incredibly vivid for him. The idea of digging in, of static lines that don't move.
It was. He says in Russia, the state was everything and civil society was gelatinous and weak. So if you cut the head off the snake, the body died. But in the West, the relationship is totally different, even if you have a massive economic crisis.
Which he compares to an artillery bombardment.
Yes, an artillery bombardment that destroys the economy. Even then, the state doesn't just fall.
Because the trenches of civil society hold firm.
Exactly. Even if the stock market crashes, the schools are still open.
Yeah.
The churches are still preaching. The media is still publishing. Families are still raising kids with more or less the same values. The trade unions are still operating within the system.
The bunker holds.
The bunker holds.
Uh-huh.
The artillery might destroy the outer wall, but the defensive line goes miles and miles deep.
That creates a massive problem for anyone who's trying to change the system. It suggests that a frontal assault, like a coup or a sudden uprising, is basically doomed to fail in a complex democracy.
It means that political change in the West requires a war of position. It's a slow, grueling, molecular struggle. You have to win the trenches one by one.
You have to change the culture before you can effectively change the government.
You have to convince the teachers, the writers, the priests, the managers. It's a long game.
That is such a powerful image. And it explains why so many revolutions in the West seem to fizzle out if they haven't done that cultural work first.
Right.
You can win an election, but if the whole of civil society is against you, if the bureaucracy, the media, and all cultural norms reject you, you can't actually govern.
It's the difference between storming a castle and changing the religion of the people inside it.
Right.
One happens overnight, the other takes generations. And Gramsci argues that the working class, or any class trying to take power, must become hegemonic before they take political office.
They have to prove they can lead culturally first.
They have to.
Now, speaking of the people inside the castle, Gramsci had a lot to say about the disconnect between the intellectuals and the people in Italy specifically. He calls this the national popular issue.
This was a huge frustration for him, a massive one. He looks at Italian history and asks, why is there such a huge gap between the elite and the masses? He critiques Italian literature and its intellectuals for being cosmopolitan.
Cosmopolitan usually sounds like a compliment today, like you're worldly, sophisticated, you drink espresso in Paris.
For Gramsci, in this context, it was a fatal weakness. It meant the intellectuals were looking at Europe, they were looking at abstract philosophy, they were looking at the Vatican. They were not speaking to the Italian people.
They were speaking to a caste.
Exactly. They didn't share the feelings or the language of the peasantry. There was no national popular literature that really resonated with the common person in the way, say, Dickens did in England.
The sources mention a specific term he uses here. Father Bresciani's progeny. Who is Bresciani?
Antonio Gramsci was a Jesuit writer from the 19th century who was essentially a reactionary. He wrote these novels that mocked the common people, the revolutionaries, the poor. Gramsci uses him as an archetype for intellectuals who despise the masses.
And he also talks about Lorianism.
Yes, this term comes up a lot in the notebooks, Lorianism. It sounds like a disease.
It kind of does.
And in Gramsci's view, it sort of was an intellectual disease. It's named after an economist named Achille Loria, who Gramsci just thought was a bizarre, lazy, and frankly unscientific thinker.
So what did he do?
Loria would just make up historical facts, use completely chaotic logic, and then present it all as profound science.
So Lorianism is pseudo-intellectualism.
It's worse than that. It represents bizarre, disorganized thinking that passes for intellect, but is actually completely disconnected from reality. It's when intellectuals are just talking to hear themselves speak, totally unmoored from the actual lives of the people. It's the failure of intellectual rigor.
So if the intellectuals are disconnected, or lazy, or even just mocking the people, you can't have hegemony.
No way. You can have domination, you can boss people around with force, but you can't lead them. Gramsci argues that if a class wants to achieve hegemony, it must align its interests with the national popular will. It has to become culturally representative.
The writer shouldn't just be writing for other writers.
They should be giving voice to the nation.
And what about the people themselves, the ones being written about or ignored? Gramsci calls them the subaltern.
Yes, the subaltern classes. These are the oppressed groups, the peasants, the workers who are on the margins of power.
He describes their history as fragmented and episodic. That's such a sad phrase.
It is, but it's also analytically very sharp. The ruling class has a unified history, the history of the state, of the kings, the wars, the treaties. We learn that history in school.
Right, it's a coherent story.
But the subaltern's history is always broken up. It's episodic. They are always on the defensive. They lack what Gramsci calls a corporate spirit, which is basically unity. They don't see themselves as a collective force with a shared history.
Because they're too busy just trying to survive.
That's part of it. But also because they tend to adopt the common sense of the ruling class.
So they see the world through their oppressor's eyes.
In many ways, yes. They might accept religious fatalism, it's God's will that I'm poor, or they accept the disorganized thinking of Lorianism, and this keeps them passive.
So, to gain power, the subaltern has to stop thinking about just their own immediate survival, which he calls corporate or selfish interests, and move to hegemonic thinking.
Exactly. They have to start proposing a universal leadership for the whole of society. They have to create their own integral history and their own organic intellectuals. They have to stop accepting the narrative that they're meant to be ruled and start building the capacity to rule themselves.
This all seems to lead us to the philosophy of praxis. Now, we mentioned earlier this was his code word for Marxism, but reading through the notes, it feels like it's more than just a label to trick the censor.
Oh, much more. It's a fundamental philosophical stance. Gramsci was writing in direct critique of what he called the popular manual.
Oh, was that?
It was a handbook on sociology by Nikolai Bukharin, a leading Soviet theorist at the time, and Gramsci hated it.
Why? Bukharin was on his side, politically speaking.
Because the manual was crudely deterministic. It treated history like physics.
Deterministic meaning. History is a machine. A automatically causes B.
Yes. The idea that history follows rigid, predictable scientific laws. The idea that capitalism will inevitably collapse and lead to socialism just because of a kind of economic gravity, or that the economy dictates everything else in society perfectly.
And Gramsci rejected that.
He argued that the philosophy of praxis is not a crystal ball. It's not a mechanical machine where you just plug in the numbers and get the future.
He says men make history.
Men make history, but not under conditions of their choosing. That's the crucial nuance. He rejects the idea that we are just puppets of economic forces. Economic crises create the terrain for politics, but they don't determine the outcome.
The will to act matters.
Human will is the decisive factor. For him, predictions in politics are not scientific laws. They are only valid to the extent that human will mobilizes to make them true.
That is incredibly empowering, but also kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
It means nothing is guaranteed. progress isn't inevitable.
Exactly. The trenches won't fall down on their own just because the economy is bad. You have to dig, you have to engage in the struggle, you have to have the will to act and to organize.
So I want to try to map this system out for the listener. If we were to draw a diagram of the world, according to the prison notebooks, what would that look like?
Okay, let's try. Imagine a map of domination. At the very top, you have the ruling class. They hold the economic base, the factories, the land, the banks.
Okay, so they have the resources.
But resources aren't enough. So stemming from them, you have the intellectuals. And remember, these are the officers. They're the ones who staff the instruments of civil society.
The instruments being?
Education, first and foremost. Gramsci is very clear. School is not neutral. It's a tool for shaping conformity and for selecting the next generation of intellectuals. Then you have the media and journals. He calls this the material structure of ideology.
And the law.
And the law. The law doesn't just punish, it educates the citizenry on what is considered necessary and normal.
And these instruments are constantly broadcasting the narratives.
Right. And the most powerful narrative of all is common sense.
We usually think of common sense as a good thing. You know, use your common sense.
Gramsci flips that completely on its head. For him, common sense is the uncritical, chaotic accumulation of traditions. It's folklore, religion, fragments of past philosophy. All the stuff people accept as just the way things are.
It's the invisible skeleton of our minds.
A perfect way to put it. It tells us that inequality is natural, or that certain people are born to rule, or that boys will be boys. It's the unexamined assumptions.
So the ruling class uses intellectuals to create these narratives via education and media. These narratives become common sense. The subaltern groups absorb this common sense and give their consent.
And that completes the feedback loop. Consent leads to stability. Power is stabilized without having to use force. The whole system runs on autopilot.
And what happens when the system fails, when that loop breaks?
When the trench system of civil society fails, when the narratives stop making sense, maybe the economy collapses so badly that common sense just breaks, the state reverts to the war of maneuver.
The police come out.
The police, the army, the armor of coercion comes out from behind the curtain. Or the society collapses into what he calls a crisis of authority. This is what Gramsci meant when he wrote that famous line, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born." In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear.
It's a complete ecosystem of power. And it explains why you can have a terrible economic situation, but people don't necessarily rebel. Because the story, the common sense, is still holding the building up.
Precisely. And Gramsci applies this framework to actual history to show us how it works in practice. He uses the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy in the 19th century, as a major case study.
This is when Italy went from being a bunch of separate warring states to one single country.
Yes, and Gramsci calls this a passive revolution.
Passive revolution. That sounds like an oxymoron. How can a revolution be passive?
It's his term for a situation where change occurs from the top down without ever really involving the peasant masses. In Italy, you had the moderates, led by Count Cavour, who maneuvered diplomatically to unify the country.
And then you had the Action Party.
Right, led by figures like Mazzini and Garibaldi. They wanted a more popular bottom-up uprising, but they failed to integrate the people, especially the peasants in the South.
So Italy got a new government, a new state, but the people weren't really part of the process.
Which resulted in what Gramsci calls a dictatorship without hegemony. The new state ruled, but it didn't have the deep consent of the masses. The southern peasants, in particular, felt like they were being colonized by the North.
And that laid the groundwork for future instability.
Yes, the instability that eventually allowed fascism to rise. Because the trenches of a national popular will were never really built in the South. The state was a foreign object to them.
Okay, now contrast that with what Gramsci saw happening in America. He has this whole fascinating section in the notebooks on Americanism and Fordism.
This is one of my favorite parts. He's looking at Henry Ford in the assembly line, but he's not just talking about making cars.
No, it's much bigger than that.
He sees Fordism as a civilizational change. It wasn't just a new way to work, it was an attempt to create a new type of worker.
He talks about the high wages, which Ford was famous for, the $5 day.
But the high wages came with a major catch. The work on the assembly line was so brutal, so repetitive, so disciplined, that the worker had to be physically and mentally pristine.
You couldn't be hungover.
You couldn't be hungover. You couldn't be exhausted from a wild night out. You couldn't be distracted thinking about your mistress.
So Gramsci actually links the assembly line to prohibition.
Yes, and to the regulation of sexuality and family life. He argues that American industrialists had a vested interest in the moral lives of their workers. Hegemony was literally being born in the factory.
They needed workers who were monogamous, sober, and stable.
Not because of some deep religious conviction, but because the machinery demanded it.
That is a wild thought. The economic structure was literally forcing a change in the culture, in morality, sex, drinking habits.
It's the ultimate example of structure dictating culture. The Puritanism wasn't just religious anymore, it was functional for this new form of high-intensity capitalism. If you want maximum efficiency, you need a stable, predictable home life. It shows that hegemonic values often have very material, economic roots.
And then, on the complete other side of the spectrum, he looks at the Catholic Church.
The church is Gramsci's great model for a state within a state. He admired, in a purely structural sense, not a religious one, how the church managed to maintain hegemony for centuries.
How did they pull it off for so long?
By keeping the intellectuals and the simple people in the same doctrinal boat. The Jesuits and the peasants might have vastly different levels of understanding. The Jesuit reads Latin theology, the peasant prays to a local saint, but they are part of the same community of belief.
Unlike the secular Italian intellectuals who looked down on the peasants and spoke a totally different language.
Correct. The church understood that you cannot let the elite separate too far from the mass or the entire structure collapses. They maintained that crucial link between the high and the low. Gramsci argued that any new political movement needed to replicate that same cohesion.
So connecting all this back to our channel's theme, crisis and perception, Gramsci really shifts the blame from bad leaders to these larger systems.
He does. He moves us completely away from individual blame. The Prince Machiavelli's term for the singular ruler is no longer a person. For Gramsci, the modern prince is the political party.
A collective organism.
A collective organism. It's about structural relationships, not just one guy making bad choices.
And he also deeply challenges the idea of choice itself.
This is the perception before choice concept right at its core. We think we're making free choices. We vote, we buy things, we choose our careers. But Gramsci forces you to ask, what is your common sense made of?
And it's made of that historical debris you mentioned.
Stone Age customs, religious fragments, scientific superstition, all of it. We perceive the world through this lens before we ever make a conscious choice. True critical thinking, what he calls good sense, requires you to critique your own worldview, to see those invisible skeletons.
You have to know why you think what you think. You have to interrogate your own common sense.
And finally, the biggest connection for us, cultural struggle precedes political change. The war of position thesis proves that you cannot change the perception of reality simply by seizing the government. It's not enough.
You have to reshape the civil society that informs perception first.
You have to change the school curriculum, the media narrative, the moral assumptions that everyone takes for granted.
If you don't, the trenches will just defeat you. The old ideas will just reemerge and swallow you whole.
It's a sobering thought, but it's also an incredibly clarifying one.
Yeah, it really changes how you view the news. When you see a debate about a school library book, or a controversial movie, or even the meaning of a single word, that isn't a distraction from real politics.
No. That is the struggle. That is the war of position happening in real time. That is where power is being negotiated.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the prison notebooks, what are the big takeaways? What do we see differently now?
I think first you get a new view of power. It is not just a gavel or a gun. It is a relationship of education and ultimately of consent.
Second, a new view of culture. It isn't just art or entertainment. It is the very trenches and fortifications that protect the economic order.
And third, a view of political change. It is a grueling molecular process. It's not a lightning strike. It's the slow, patient organization of a new collective will.
It really makes you look at your own common sense in a different light.
And that leads to a final provocative thought for the listener to take away. If common sense is just the accumulated debris of past power structures that we accept as truth, what parts of our current reality, the things we think are just natural, are actually just the fossilized ideology of a previous century?
What are we accepting today that is actually just the ghost of a dead system?
Something to mull over.
This deep dive was based on Prison Notebooks, volumes 1 through 3, by Antonio Gramsci, published by Columbia University Press. We highly encourage you to consult the library editions for the full philological experience. There is so much more in there than we could cover.
It's a difficult read, but a very rewarding one.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for listening.